When we look back at Watch Dogs 1, most people talk about the hacking, the graphics controversy, or Aiden Pearce's story. But one thing that doesn't get nearly enough credit is how the game nailed the idea of living surveillance. A city where you weren't just the watcher, but also the one being watched. And revisiting it in 2025 makes that concept hit even harder. Chicago in Watch Dogs 1 wasn't just an open-world sandbox. It was a city wired with cameras, sensors, and interconnected systems, all tied into ctOS. At first, it felt empowering because you could tap into that network and use it to your advantage. You could peek into alleyways, scan phone calls, hack traffic lights, and feel like the ultimate puppet master. But if you really think about it, the game was also putting you in the middle of a system that was always looking back at you. One of the most overlooked details was how the police could instantly access ctOS to track you down. It wasn't just about patrol cars chasing you. It was cameras locking onto your location, helicopters tracing your movements, and your own hacks sometimes betraying your presence. You were never completely safe because the very tools that made you powerful were also the tools that made you vulnerable. That's a concept that feels chillingly realistic today. And here's the wild part. Watch Dogs. One came out in 2014, back when mass surveillance still felt like a conspiracy theory to a lot of people. But now, in 2025, we live in a world where cameras are on every street corner, facial recognition is a standard tool for governments, and even your phone listens in on you. Suddenly, the paranoia baked into Watch Dogs doesn't feel like science fiction anymore. It feels like everyday life. What made this so effective in the game was the atmosphere. Every time you hacked into a camera, you weren't just solving a puzzle. You were peering into people's homes, businesses, and private lives. Sometimes you'd stumble across random moments that had nothing to do with the main story. A couple arguing, someone watching TV, or a criminal planning something shady. Those little glimpses reminded you that surveillance isn't just about systems. It's about people being exposed without their knowledge. This is what made Watch Dogs 1 stand out from its sequels. Watch Dogs 2 was brighter and more playful, and Legion leaned into its futuristic angle, but they didn't have that same weight of being constantly observed. The first game captured the unease of living in a world where privacy doesn't really exist, and it wrapped it into the gameplay in a way that felt seamless. Revisiting it now, Watch Dogs 1 almost feels prophetic. It wasn't perfect. The gameplay had its flaws, and Aiden wasn't the most compelling character, but the vision it presented about surveillance has only become more relevant with time. And that's why, more than a decade later, the game still deserves to be talked about. Because sometimes the scariest part of Watch Dogs 1 wasn't what you could see. It was the reminder that someone, somewhere, could always see you. When most people talk about Watch Dogs 1, they mention the graphics downgrade, the hacking system, or Aiden Pearce's story of revenge. But something that's often overlooked, and honestly one of the most fascinating aspects of the game, is how Watch Dogs 1 quietly predicted the rise of a completely connected economy. And when you look back at it now in 2025, it feels less like a game mechanic and more like a glimpse into the future we're already living in. Think about how money worked in Watch Dogs 1. You could walk through the streets of Chicago, scan an NPC's bank account, and instantly siphon cash with a couple of taps on your phone. At the time, it felt like a cool gimmick to give you quick spending money for weapons and upgrades. But when you really stop and think about it, Ubisoft was showing us something way bigger: the fragility of digital economies. In Watch Dogs, physical cash barely mattered. Everything was digital, everything was connected, and all of it was hackable. And here's the crazy part. In 2014, that felt futuristic. But in 2025, that's just reality. Most people today don't carry physical cash. We tap cards, we scan phones, we use digital wallets. And some countries are already experimenting with central bank digital currencies. And every time we do, we're trusting massive networks that could, in theory, be exploited the same way Aiden Pearce exploited Chicago's ctOS. The game even hinted at the darker side of this. Remember how profiling NPCs sometimes revealed their financial struggles. People deep in debt, unemployed, working multiple jobs. The ability to drain their accounts wasn't just a gameplay mechanic. It reflected how vulnerable people are when their entire financial lives exist in data that's outside of their control. It was Ubisoft's way of showing that when systems control everything, ordinary people are the ones at risk. What makes it so immersive is that Watch Dogs 1 didn't shove this in your face. It wasn't a big story beat or a cutscene. It was built into the background of gameplay, into the little details you'd notice if you paid attention. And that subtlety made the world feel so much more believable, because in real life, that's exactly how it happens. Technology doesn't suddenly take over in one big moment. It creeps in slowly, until one day you look around and realize your entire life is digital, and all of it can be accessed by someone with the right tools. This is why Watch Dogs 1 stands apart from its sequels. Watch Dogs 2 leaned more into satire and fun, while Legion pushed the play-as-anyone gimmick. But neither of them captured that uneasy feeling the first game nailed, the sense that the systems we rely on every day are more fragile and more exploitable than we'd like to admit. And let's not forget the irony here. When Watch Dogs 1 released, a lot of players dismissed the bank hacking as unrealistic or over the top. Yet here we are in 2025, where crypto hacks, digital heists, and stolen identities make headlines on a regular basis. It feels less like a sci-fi warning and more like Ubisoft accidentally predicted what would become one of the defining issues of our time. So when people look back at Watch Dogs 1, it's worth remembering that the game wasn't just about car chases and hacking traffic lights. It was about showing us how fragile trust in connected systems really is. And that's why it's still worth revisiting today. Not just as an open-world game, but as a chilling glimpse of the world we live in now. When most people think about Watch Dogs 1, they remember the hacking gimmicks, the surveillance cameras, and Aiden Pearce's trench coat. But one thing that rarely gets talked about is how the game quietly explored the idea of digital reputation systems long before they became part of our daily lives. In the game, every action you took, whether you stopped a crime or caused chaos, was tracked by the public. Pedestrians would recognize you, news broadcasts would change their tone, and the city itself responded to how it perceived you. At the time, it felt like a neat mechanic to add consequence to your choices. But looking back from 2025, it feels eerily close to the systems we see emerging in the real world. Today, we have social credit experiments, online reputation scores, and algorithm-driven profiles that determine what we can access, how we're treated, and even whether we're trusted. Watch Dogs was playing with those ideas in 2014, long before most of us realized how powerful data-driven judgments could become. The chilling part is that the game treated it as background flavor, almost a side mechanic, when in reality, it may be the most important prediction it made, because it asked a subtle question we're still grappling with. What happens when your digital shadow, built from data you can't always control, becomes more important than who you are in real life? That's the part of Watch Dogs we didn't fully appreciate back then, but in hindsight, it might have been its most forward-thinking idea.
Who was that?
Doesn't matter, just some...
When most people revisit Watch Dogs 1, they talk about the hacking, the graphics downgrade, or Aiden Pearce's story. But one thing hardly anyone brings up is how personal data shaped the entire experience. And honestly, it might be the creepiest part of the game that still feels relevant today. The profiler wasn't just a gimmick. It made every single NPC feel like a real person. You'd scan a random pedestrian and suddenly learn they were deep in debt, suffering from an illness, or even involved in shady activities. That tiny detail instantly gave weight to people who would otherwise just be background filler. And the wild part is, you didn't need to know any of it, but you couldn't resist. It pulled you into the role of a voyeur, making you complicit in invading people's lives. In 2025, this mechanic feels even more prophetic. Think about how much of our information is floating around online right now. Social media, digital footprints, constant surveillance. Watchdogs. One predicted a future where private data is never really private. And the game forced you to confront the question: if you had access to all that information, would you use it responsibly or exploit it? That's why this overlooked detail makes Watch Dogs 1 stand out even today. Because sometimes the scariest part of the game wasn't the hacking or the gunfights, but what you learned about the people around you.
Okay. Here goes.
When you revisit Watch Dogs 1 today, it's easy to focus on the hacking or the story of Aiden Pearce. But something that's rarely discussed is how the game handled morality through its vigilante system.
Am I ready?
And honestly, this feature made you think about justice in a way most open-world games never even tried.
Happy birthday.
In Watch Dogs 1, you weren't just a hero or a criminal. You were constantly balancing in between. The vigilante reputation system tracked everything you did. If you stopped crimes, protected civilians, and kept collateral damage low, the public began to see you as a hero. But if you caused chaos, hurt bystanders, or abused your hacking powers, the media would frame you as a dangerous menace. Suddenly, Chicago didn't just react to your actions mechanically, it judged you morally. And the genius of it is that it was never black and white. Unlike games with clear good or evil choices, Watch Dogs 1 built morality into the world itself. A single mistake during a chase, maybe running over a civilian, could tank your reputation. Even if your intentions were good, the city remembered the cost of your actions. That created tension, because every decision carried weight. Were you truly protecting Chicago, or were you just another criminal with better tech? The best part is how subtle this system was. News reports on radios would talk about your deeds. NPCs would react differently, either cheering you on or calling you a thug. It was immersive because it made Chicago feel like it had an opinion about you. Other open-world games had morality meters, but Watch Dogs 1 tied it directly into how the world perceived you. Revisiting it in 2025, the vigilante system feels even more relevant. In an age of social media, public perception often defines someone's reputation more than their intentions. Watch Dogs 1 captured that idea before it became mainstream. You're not just what you do, you're what the world thinks you do. It's one of the reasons why Watch Dogs 1 stands apart from its sequels. Watch Dogs 2 and Legion leaned into brighter tones and player freedom, but they lost that gritty moral weight. The first game made you constantly question whether Aiden was a hero, a villain, or something in between. So, while Watch Dogs 1 wasn't perfect, the vigilante system deserves way more credit. It made morality personal, tied it into gameplay, and reminded players that even in a digital city, actions always have consequences. When people talk about Watch Dogs 1, they usually bring up the hacking, the graphics downgrade, or Aiden Pearce's story. But one thing almost nobody talks about is how the game used its NPC profiling system to make Chicago feel unsettlingly human. Every time you scanned a pedestrian, you got a snapshot of their life, their salary, habits, criminal history, or even strange little secrets. It was simple, but it made the city feel alive in a way no other open-world game had done before. Suddenly, you weren't just walking past generic NPCs. You were looking at people with personal struggles, odd quirks, and hidden lives. It gave Chicago this eerie, voyeuristic vibe, because you had access to information you were never supposed to see. What's fascinating is how this mechanic blurred the line between gameplay and social commentary. It wasn't just fun. It made you think about how much data companies and governments have on us in the real world. Back in 2014, it felt like a gimmick. Now, in 2025, with everything from social media algorithms to facial recognition tracking us, it feels terrifyingly real. This is why Watch Dogs 1 stands apart from its sequels. Watch Dogs 2 and Legion had more colorful tones and bigger mechanics, but they never recaptured that feeling of paranoia that came from simply pointing your phone at a stranger. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest details are what make a game timeless.
Watch it.
Somebody tried to break into my house last night. Cops rolled up. I can't get over this election. No. And I know. No.
When Watch Dogs 1 first released in 2014, most people focused on its graphics downgrade or compared it directly to GTA. But something that often gets overlooked is how this game captured a very real emotion: digital paranoia. It came out in an era when people were just beginning to realize how much their phones, cameras, and social media were watching them. And Watch Dogs 1 tapped into that fear before it became mainstream. Think about it. The entire game revolves around ctOS, a citywide operating system that controls everything: traffic lights, security cameras, bank accounts, even people's personal data. And you, as Aiden Pearce, could manipulate all of it with just your smartphone. At first glance, it feels empowering, but the longer you play, the more you realize the unsettling truth. If Aiden can do it, anyone else could too. Suddenly, the game world makes you paranoid. Because every street corner has a camera, every stranger might be hiding a secret, and every digital system is a potential vulnerability. What's wild is how predictive this was. Back in 2014, the world was still reacting to the Edward Snowden leaks and the revelations about mass surveillance. People were starting to understand that governments and corporations could track your online activity, your phone records, even your movements. Watch Dogs. One didn't just use that as background noise. It built its entire identity around it. Playing it today in 2025, it almost feels prophetic. The game basically asked, what happens when technology controls everything, and who can really be trusted with that power? This is where Watch Dogs 1 stands apart from other open-world games. GTA gave us satire about crime and culture. Assassin's Creed gave us historical conspiracies. But Watch Dogs 1 gave us something far closer to home: the fear that the devices we rely on every day could be used against us. That's why walking through Chicago in this game feels different from walking through Los Santos. It's not just about what you can do in the world. It's about the unease of realizing how exposed you are within it. And let's not forget the profiling mechanic. Every time you point your phone at a pedestrian, you're given a slice of their life, their income, their habits, sometimes even their darkest secrets. It's addicting as a gameplay mechanic, but it's also creepy. It makes you reflect on how much data real companies have on us, and how easily that information can strip away privacy. Watch Dogs 1 made surveillance part of the fun, but it also made it clear how invasive it could feel. Fast forward to today, and that paranoia has only grown. Between smartphones, AI, and facial recognition, the themes Watch Dogs 1 introduced hit harder now than they did at launch. When you think about Watch Dogs 1, most people remember the hacking, the gritty tone, or Aiden Pearce's trench coat. But what often gets overlooked is how Ubisoft designed Chicago itself, not just as a setting, but as a living, breathing character in the story. And revisiting it today in 2025 makes that clearer than ever. Chicago in Watch Dogs. One wasn't just a backdrop for car chases and shootouts. It was crafted to reflect themes of surveillance, crime, and control. The constant hum of trains, the neon glow of downtown, the rain-soaked alleys, all of it contributed to a feeling of unease, like the city itself was watching you. And that's the genius of it. Unlike GTA's Los Santos, which leaned into satire, or Assassin's Creed's historical cities, Watch Dogs gave us a Chicago that felt both authentic and unsettling. What's even more impressive is how much personality the game gave to everyday details. You could walk past random NPCs, and instantly know a piece of their life from your profiler. Suddenly, the city wasn't just populated with filler characters, it was full of people with stories. Someone struggling with debt, someone working 2 jobs, someone hiding a criminal record. It made you look at the city differently, because every corner felt alive with secrets. And then there's the way the city reacts to you. Chase scenes felt chaotic, not just because of police, but because of how hacking let you manipulate the environment. You weren't just driving through streets, you were raising bridges, triggering blockades, and sending traffic lights into chaos. Chicago wasn't static. It was responsive, like an unpredictable character you had to outsmart. Even today, in 2025, few open-world games have captured that same atmosphere. Watch Dogs 2 and Legion went bigger and brighter, but they lost that sense of paranoia that Chicago nailed. Revisiting it now feels like stepping into a noir thriller where the city itself is complicit in everything happening around you. So when we talk about Watch Dogs 1, we shouldn't just talk about Aiden Pearce or the hacking mechanics. We should remember Chicago as one of the most important characters Ubisoft ever created. When people look back at Watch Dogs 1, the first thing they usually remember is the graphics controversy, the gritty Chicago atmosphere, or the revenge story of Aiden Pearce. But something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough is how Watch Dogs 1's hacking system wasn't just a gimmick. It was actually one of the most revolutionary mechanics in open-world gaming, and it quietly changed the way developers approached player freedom. Think about the state of open-world games before 2014. You had GTA, you had Assassin's Creed, you had Saints Row. These games gave you big worlds and plenty of things to do, but most of the interactions were limited to shooting, driving, or climbing. The cities looked alive, but you couldn't really interact with them in meaningful ways. Watch Dogs came in and flipped that expectation on its head. Suddenly, the environment itself became a weapon. A stoplight wasn't just a background prop. It was something you could trigger to cause a car crash. A steam pipe wasn't just set dressing. You could make it explode under your enemies. The world stopped being static and started being dynamic, and that's what made Watch Dogs stand out. And it wasn't just about combat. The way hacking let you peek into NPCs' lives, seeing their names, incomes, secrets, and even shady activities, added a layer of immersion that no open-world game had pulled off before. Suddenly, every single pedestrian in Chicago felt like a real person. Sure, a lot of it was surface level, but at the time, it was groundbreaking. Other games filled their crowds with nameless, faceless AI. Watch Dogs said, no, every character you see has a story, even if it's just a one-line profile. That made Chicago feel alive in a way no other city in gaming did. What's crazy is how hacking changed the way players thought about missions. In most open-world games, the formula was simple: sneak, shoot, escape. But in Watch Dogs 1, hacking turned stealth and combat into puzzle solving. Do you distract guards by triggering a ringtone? Do you set up an ambush by exploding a transformer? Do you block a chase by raising bridges? Suddenly, every mission had multiple solutions, and it was up to the player to decide how creative they wanted to be. That kind of sandbox problem solving is something that's now expected in games, but back then it was fresh. Even multiplayer had hacking baked into it in a genius way. Invasion mode, where another player could secretly hack you while blending into the crowd, was ahead of its time. It blurred the line between single player and multiplayer, making the city feel unpredictable. At any moment, you weren't just fighting NPCs, you might be outsmarted by another human. That type of integrated multiplayer is something games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring get a lot of credit for. But Watch Dogs 1 was already experimenting with it in 2014. Of course, Watch Dogs 1 wasn't perfect. The story was criticized for being too serious. The driving felt clunky, and people were disappointed with the graphical downgrade. But the hacking? That's the one mechanic everyone remembers, and for good reason. It gave players a sense of control over the world that no other open-world game offered at the time. Ubisoft may have stumbled in other areas, but with hacking, they genuinely innovated. Fast forward to today, and you can see its influence everywhere. Games like Cyberpunk 2077 took hacking and expanded it into an entire RPG system. Rockstar started adding more interactive world elements into GTA online updates. When most people think back to Watch Dogs 1, they remember the hype, the graphics downgrade controversy, and the comparisons to GTA. But if you take all that away and just play the game in 2025, something becomes really clear. Watch Dogs 1 is actually way more realistic than people gave it credit for at the time. And honestly, that realism is what makes it stand out even now. Let's start with the city itself. A lot of open-world games back then felt like giant playgrounds, but Watch Dogs' version of Chicago actually feels like a living place. The rain, the wind, the way the streets look after a storm, the whole vibe is grounded in realism. You're not just driving through a flashy cartoon city, you're moving through an environment that feels like it could really exist. It's gritty, sometimes even depressing, and that tone makes the hacking and surveillance elements way more believable. Then there's the people. Watch Dogs did something subtle but brilliant with NPCs. Every single one has a personal profile. At first glance, it's just a neat gimmick, but it actually makes the world feel populated by individuals instead of clones. You scan someone and see they're an off-duty nurse, or a struggling musician, or maybe someone with a dark secret. It's not just window dressing either. Sometimes these details tie into crimes about to happen, or they reveal things about the city you'd never notice otherwise. In 2025, when so many games still rely on generic background characters, this level of detail feels surprisingly modern. And let's be real, Aiden Pearce gets a lot of hate as a protagonist. People said he was too serious, too bland, not charismatic enough. But when you think about the story being told, his personality actually fits. He's not supposed to be a wisecracking hero. He's a guy obsessed with control, with revenge, and with protecting the few people he cares about. His coldness isn't bad writing. It's realism. If someone actually went through what he did, they wouldn't be cracking jokes. They'd be broken, obsessed, and a little scary. That doesn't make him the most fun character, but it does make him feel authentic. The combat and stealth also lean into this sense of realism. You can go in guns blazing, sure, but the game always pushes you toward thinking smart, using cover, using cameras, using traps. That's more how a real hacker-turned-vigilante would operate. He wouldn't be a superhero mowing down waves of enemies. He'd be using the environment, staying hidden, and only striking when the timing was right. The game doesn't force you to play that way, but when you do, it feels right. One of the most overlooked realistic touches is how the world reacts to you. Pull a gun in public and people panic, but some don't just run. Some call the cops, and if you're not quick enough, you suddenly have a whole new problem on your hands. In other words, you can't just act like a maniac in the streets without consequences, which makes Chicago feel like a real city instead of just a sandbox waiting to be wrecked. Even the driving, which a lot of people criticized, kind of fits into this realism. Cars in Watch Dogs aren't as smooth and arcade-like as other games. They're heavier, harder to control, and sometimes frustrating. But once you get used to it, it makes chases feel more intense. When you finally escape the cops using hacks and careful driving, it feels earned, not just like you sped away because the game was easy. And then there are the themes: surveillance, data privacy, corporations having too much power. In 2014, those ideas felt like edgy science fiction. But in 2025, it feels like Ubisoft accidentally made a documentary in video game form. That's the kind of realism that makes you stop and think, even when you're just messing around in the game world. So when people say Watch Dogs 1 hasn't aged well, I think they're looking at it through the wrong lens. Yeah, it had flaws, and yeah, it didn't live up to its impossible hype.